Good day and welcome back to Scriptures Unlocked. We are now on to Genesis chapter 45, and in this presentation, we'll see how Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. And in revealing himself to his brothers, Joseph will then outline to them that what they did to him, he could now look back in hindsight and see God's hand at play in all his experiences in Egypt. So this presentation is entitled, Joseph Reveals Himself to His Brothers. In the previous presentation, we ended with Judah making an eloquent and impassioned plea on behalf of Benjamin, where he also offered to take his brother's place and become the governor's slave so that Benjamin could return to his father. When Joseph heard Judah's intervention, he had seen enough evidence from his brothers to be convinced that there was a radical change in their characters. Judah's act of self-sacrificing love was the defining moment which resulted in Joseph being overcome by emotions at what he was both seeing and hearing. Joseph was now going to reveal his true identity to his brothers, because up to this point, they had no clue that the quote-unquote man that they know as the governor of Egypt was the brother they had sold into slavery, which takes us now to Genesis 45, verse 1. And this is coming on the heels of Judah making that impassioned plea. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him. And he cried, "Cause every man to go out from me." And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brethren. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said unto his brethren, "I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live?" And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. So in other words, viewers, Joseph's brothers were speechless in his presence. And here you can see Joseph being overwhelmed by the emotions of the moment and crying before his brothers, breaking down in tears because of what he was hearing from Judah as his brothers' characters were being revealed before his eyes. The Hebrew word translated as terrified is the Hebrew word bahal. It occurs 39 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It is Strong's H 926. It has been translated as trouble 17 times, haste 4 times, and you can see the rest of the meaning on screen. It means to disturb, to alarm, terrify, be disturbed, be anxious, to be nervous. In other words, it means to tremble inwardly or palpitate, that is figuratively, be alarmed. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, I pray you." And they came near. And he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom he sold into Egypt." Joseph's brothers were fearful, and the clear implication of verse 4 is that they had taken a few steps backward when he revealed his true identity. So he had to reassure them that he would not do them any harm because it was in his power so to do. Joseph, viewers, was now clearly speaking to them in Hebrew, because prior to this, he always spoke to them through an interpreter who translated from the Egyptian language to Hebrew. And he had commanded all of the Egyptians to leave the room while he conversed with his brothers. So in other words, in Hebrew, Joseph said, "Ani Yosef." Ani is a Hebrew word for "I am," and Joseph's name in Hebrew is pronounced Yosef. So Joseph said to them, "Ani Yosef." And when he said that, they were terrified, they were alarmed to see that the man they knew as the governor of Egypt was the brother, as Joseph said to them, whom he sold into slavery. So when he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom he sold into Egypt," this was to confirm the truth of his statement, because this was a closely guarded secret that only the 10 brothers knew about. Jacob did not know about it, and this was the first time that Benjamin was hearing the real reason why Joseph did not return home 22 years ago. They were totally shocked to learn that Joseph was no longer a slave, but he was alive, and he had become the second most powerful person in Egypt. So Joseph proceeded to calm their fears. So here's Joseph saying to them, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Notice what he then says to them. Genesis 45, verse 5 to 8. Now therefore, be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves, that ye sold me hither, that is in Egypt. For God did send me before you to preserve life. Notice Joseph's outlook on his experiences in Egypt. All that happened to him, from being sold as a slave, being bought by Potiphar, being accused of rape, a crime he did not commit, being imprisoned, and then rising to this lofty position as the governor of all Egypt. Joseph could look back in hindsight and say, even though what you did was evil, God's hand was on my life. He said, for God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years had the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years to come, in the which there shall neither be airing, that is plowing, nor harvest, reaping. And God sent me before you to preserve your posterity in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God. And he had made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. So Joseph told his brothers that the evil they intended against him was used by God for good, since he has now placed me in a position where he was able to save them and the entire family. Joseph could now look back at his experiences in hindsight and see God's providential hand at play. Viewers, Joseph understood that God is sovereign and that nothing could happen to him without God allowing it. So by looking at the outcome, he now knew that God was working out his purpose for good. It was definitely not God's will for Joseph to be sold into slavery. That was his brother's plan. But God used a bad situation and turned it into good. Notice what Paul tells us in Romans 8, verse 28. And we know, and this is what Joseph was saying, and we know that all things, both the good and the bad, work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. So God clearly had a plan for Joseph's life, and that is why God gave him those dreams all those years before, when he was 17 years old. Joseph was the called of God, because God had a purpose for him. His brothers tried to stop God's plan for his life, and they sold him into Egypt, but God was still able to use a bad situation and work it for his purposes. So Joseph was called according to God's purpose, and his Egyptian experiences worked together for good. Notice how God used a bad situation for good. And this tells us that we cannot catch God off guard. His brothers tried to, because remember what they said. Here comes this dreamer. Let us kill him and see what will become of his dreams. So they were trying to thwart God's plan for Joseph's life. They were trying to kill Joseph's dream. But God still worked it out, where the dream that Joseph had, which was a prophecy of the future, was still carried out. So notice some of these hypothetical that I'm going to present to you, and show us that no matter what people try to do, anything that God says will come to pass. God tells us that his words will not return unto him void. Notice this, viewers. If Joseph's brothers had not sold him as a slave, he never would have been taken to Egypt. If Joseph was never taken to Egypt, then he could not have been bought by Potiphar. If Potiphar had not bought Joseph, then Potiphar's wife never could have accused Joseph of rape. If Joseph was not falsely accused of rape, he certainly would not have been put in prison for a crime he did not commit. If Joseph was not imprisoned, he would never have met Pharaoh's chief butler and chief baker. If Joseph never met Pharaoh's officials, he could not have interpreted their respective dreams. If Joseph never interpreted their dreams, his ability to interpret dreams would never have been known. If Joseph's abilities were not known, then he would not have been recommended to Pharaoh. If Joseph never interpreted Pharaoh's dream, he never would have become the governor of Egypt. If Joseph was never put in a position of influence, Egypt would have been unprepared for the famine that was to come. If Joseph never prepared Egypt for the famine to come, his family back in Canaan would have died of starvation. If Joseph's family back in Canaan died, then the Messiah, who was the promised seed of the woman that was made to the serpent all the way back in Genesis 3 verse 15, could never have descended from the tribe of Judah. If the Messiah was never born, then the world would never have had a Jewish savior. All those if statements, all those suppositions, the aforementioned sequence of events are all suppositions, but it shows how God used Joseph's experiences to ultimately accomplish his purpose. And that is the beauty of God. No matter what man tries to do, God is always a million steps ahead of whatever plans man and the devil can concoct. And these sequence of events show us that what his brothers did to him, the bad experiences that he had in Egypt, God was able to work it out for good. Viewers, this is Joseph saying to them, I am your brother Joseph. Notice what he then goes on to say to them. Genesis 45 verse 9 to 13. Haste thee and go up to my father and say unto him, Thus saith thy son Joseph, God had made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down unto me, tarry not, and thou shalt dwell in the land of Goshen, and thou shalt be near unto me, thou and thy children, and thy children's children, and thy flocks, and thy herds, and all that thou hast. And there will I nourish thee, for yet there are 5 years of famine, lest thou and thy household and all that thou hast come to poverty. And behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin, that it is my mouth that speaketh unto you. And he shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt, and of all that he have seen, and he shall haste and bring down my father hither. So viewers, Joseph kept his focus on God and referenced the fact that God made him, quote unquote, Lord of all Egypt. And he invited his entire family to relocate to Egypt. So this is Joseph telling them to make haste and go back to the land of Canaan and bring my father back to the land of Egypt, where I can provide for him for the remaining 5 years of famine that is yet to come. Notice verses 14 to 20. And he, Joseph, fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck, and he wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck. Moreover, he kissed all his brethren and wept upon them. And after that, his brethren talked with him. So here you can see, viewers, that Joseph was very affectionate with every single one of his brothers, starting with Benjamin. He hugged them, he kissed them, they cried together, and he hugged every single one of them. All 11 brothers were shown affection by Joseph, which shows us that Joseph never had any ill will towards his brothers for what they did to him. Joseph understood the big picture, that the evil that they did to him, God had turned it around for good. It was not God's plan for his brothers to sell Joseph into slavery, but God was able to use the bad situation and work it for good, so that Joseph could be put in a position where he could influence the policies of Egypt. And as a result, he was promoted to the second most powerful position in all of Egypt. So that is what happened. Joseph could see the big picture. Looking back, he could see the hand of God, the providence of God working out in his life. So viewers, he was affectionate to his brothers, and the fame thereof was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brethren are come, and it pleased Pharaoh well, and his servants. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Say unto thy brethren, This do ye, lay your beasts, and go, get you unto the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households, and come unto me. And I will give you the good of the land of Egypt, and ye shall eat the fat of the land. Now therefore, now thou art commanded, this do ye, take you wagons out of the land of Egypt for your little ones, and for your wives, and bring your father, and come. Also regard not your stuff. So in other words, you don't even have to pack anything from the land of Canaan. You can leave everything that you have in terms of material possessions and come to Egypt, for the good of all the land of Egypt is yours. This is what Pharaoh was commanding Joseph to tell his brothers. So here you can see Joseph hugging his brother Benjamin, the son of his mother Rachel. Genesis 45 verse 21 to 24 tells us this. And the children of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons according to the commandment of Pharaoh, and gave them provision for the way. To all of them he gave each man changes of raiment, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of raiment. And to his father he sent after this manner 10 asses laden with the good things of Egypt, and 10 she-asses laden with corn and bread, and meat for his father by the way. So he sent his brethren away, and they departed. And he said unto them, see that ye fall not out by the way. So Joseph here gave his brothers a change of clothing, because his brothers would be a reflection of him. He was the governor of Egypt, so he ensured that his brothers received new clothing that would befit brothers to the governor of Egypt. Joseph's brothers were treated royally by him, and they received a personal invitation from Pharaoh to return to Egypt. And as they departed, Joseph told them not to quarrel on the way by casting blame on each other for the part they played in selling him as a slave. Joseph was essentially saying, let bygones be bygones. But these brothers, it's just human nature. They were now exposed, and they would have to go back and tell their father that Joseph is alive. And their father would eventually find out that they had a hand in Joseph being missing for 22 years out of his father's life. So they were now worried as they were heading back to the land of Canaan. And Joseph understood this, and he told them not to quarrel, not to play the blame game as they were making their way back to Canaan. So Joseph showed maturity. Joseph showed leadership. Notice what transpired. Genesis 45 verse 25 to 28. And they went up out of Egypt and came into the land of Canaan unto Jacob their father, and told him, saying, Joseph is yet alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt. And Jacob's heart fainted, for he believed them not. And they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said unto them. And when he saw the wagons which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. And Israel said, and remember, Israel is the new name of Jacob. And Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is yet alive. I will go and see him before I die. So viewers, Jacob initially failed to believe the incredible report of his sons, because these sons had led him to believe that Joseph was dead. But now they were telling him that Joseph was alive, and he was also the governor of Egypt and a powerful individual. Viewers, the Hebrew word translated as governor is mashal. It occurs 81 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It is Strong's H 4910. It has been translated as rule 38 times, ruler 19 times, reign 8 times, dominion 7 times, governor 4 times. So mashal, which is what Joseph was the ruler over Egypt, just as Pharaoh said. He had dominion over the Egyptians. He reigned over Egypt as the second in command under Pharaoh's leadership. He was the one that exercised dominion and rule. So mashal means to rule, to have dominion, or to be a governor. So here you can see Judah and his brethren telling Jacob that Joseph is alive, and not just alive, but he's the governor. He's the ruler over all the land of Egypt. Viewers, Jacob did not believe them initially. However, when he saw the wagons along with the various asses laden with food items, he was convinced by what he was seeing, because wheeled carriages like wagons were a rare sight in those days. The Hebrew word for wagon is agalah. It is Strong's H 5696. And it simply means something revolving, that is, a wheeled vehicle. Can be a cart, a chariot, or a wagon. So hearing that his beloved son was alive after being quote unquote dead to him for 22 years made Jacob excited with joy, and he was willing to go to Egypt and see his son Joseph before he died. So viewers, that brings us to the end of this presentation on Genesis chapter 45, where after a series of tests from Joseph to his brothers, he finally revealed himself, his true identity, as their brother whom they sold into Egypt. And this was a grand family reunion. And Joseph invited his brethren to come to Egypt to live so that they could be spared from the remaining 5 years of famine that is yet to come. In the next presentation, we will see Jacob and his entire family moving from the land of Canaan to go to reside in the land of Egypt. And this, again, shows that God has a way of fulfilling his word. Because in Genesis chapter 15, God told Abraham, that's Jacob's grandfather. Jacob's father was Isaac. Isaac's father was Abraham. God told Abraham in Genesis 15 that know of a surety that your seed, your descendants, will be strangers in a land that is not their own. And this land that God was referring to was the land of Egypt. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. And after 400 years, God would bring them out with a great deliverance, and they would come out with great substance. So what we are seeing here for the remaining chapters in the book of Genesis is how Jacob, who was now renamed Israel, would end up in Egypt, and how they would blossom into a large multitude of people. And that eventually, after Joseph's time has passed, a new Pharaoh would arise and would enslave the children of Israel, or the children of Jacob, who in the next presentation we will see making their trek down to the land of Egypt. So this is just to put things in perspective and to show that God has a way of accomplishing his purpose. God says what he means, and he means exactly what he says. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And may God continue to bless us as we continue to study his words to prove all things. Have yourselves a great day.